For the next part of this lecture, we are going to talk about knowing ourselves through introspection. Introspection refers to the process whereby people look inward and examine their own thoughts, feelings, and motives or motivations. Just a common misconception or bias, I suppose, that many people have is that they believe that they introspect far more than they actually do. Some studies have been done around this where they gave people pagers. I don't know if that's probably something most people recognize anymore, but they can be called and beep at certain times, and the researchers would have these people wear them and have them randomly beep and record whether or not they were introspecting or thinking about themselves in that moment, and then they counted randomly throughout the day how much they were actually introspecting. It turns out to be quite little, actually. A way you could do this for yourself if you felt like doing it, though of course this is not really scientific for many reasons, you could put a rubber band on your wrist, and every time you notice it throughout the day, which probably will be relatively randomly, you can make a little tally mark somewhere about whether you were introspecting about yourself or whether you were not. And at the end of the day, you could count these out. If you really wanted to make a prediction beforehand, you could totally do that, but just be wary of hindsight bias. Further, it is important to remember, and we'll touch on this throughout the entirety of the lecture, that just because you introspect and come up with a reason for your thoughts or your feelings or your motivations doesn't mean that those reasons are actually correct, no matter how much those reasons feel or seem like they're appropriate. Before we get into the actual nitty-gritty of introspection, it is important to consider how we become aware of ourselves. So just commonly thinking about it, there's this idea that we're just aware of ourselves and we can sit down and become aware of ourselves and we're always thinking about ourselves, and this is related to sort of the image we have of ourselves as human beings. But it is actually much more dependent on the environment we find ourselves in. And so before that, it's important to consider self-awareness theory, and this is the idea that when people focus their attention on themselves, they evaluate and compare their behavior to some internal standards or values they have about themselves. So this is the idea that when we are thinking about ourselves, we are looking at ourselves as some third-party objective observer would be looking at us and analyzing us and comparing it to some idealized template that we also have of ourselves and matching what parts are actually working in line with our expectations and which ones are not. Of course, there is no actual third party. We're doing this to ourselves. The most common way in which this focus tends to arise or be primed, you could say, is through some type of environmental cues. And many common ones of these are, for example, mirrors. When we see ourselves in a mirror, we automatically tend to, at least for a brief period, think about ourselves. Cameras are another way in which this happens. When we see a camera, especially when it's taking a photo of us, we tend to be automatically prone to start thinking of ourselves or even some audience of some kind. This is probably one of the reasons why public speaking is so difficult for so many people, is that they get lost in this overwhelming thought patterns of how are they being perceived and therefore judged by the audience. And they spend less time focusing on the material that they're actually trying to present. And this can throw a lot of people off. When we do compare ourselves to our expectations and ideals, this can go one of two ways. In the first, these all line up and match. Our current behaviors match our expectations and our ideals, and in that case, we tend to experience a positive state of self-awareness. You give yourself a sort of figurative pat on the back in your own mind. And if they do not, though, then we tend to experience a negative state of self-awareness. And this would take place whenever we are primed to pay attention to ourselves. So you walk past a mirror and you're smoking a cigarette and you have been trying to give up smoking cigarettes. And so you see yourself doing something that you think you should not be doing, and this will often lead to a negative state of self-awareness. And it need not be something like cigarettes, but this happens in exercise behaviors, in eating behaviors, in relationship dynamics, in conversation dynamics. It's pretty much all over the place that we have tremendous amounts of expectations about how we are supposed to be, and not always do we live up to those expectations. When it comes to negative states of self-awareness, which we'll of course pay much more attention to, because when you're feeling a positive state of self-awareness, well, that's great for the individual and hopefully they can keep it up. Well, not much really to say other than that. That, and of course psychology, other than in recent years, tends to focus much more on negative states than positive states. We are, after all, creatures that like to fix things that are broken and not maintain things that work well. But that's different. Okay. Negative states of self-awareness can be incredibly aversive. This means we dislike them and they're uncomfortable and we don't want to feel them, and we will go through incredible lengths and hoops and dances and jumps to avoid those feelings. And this can be very simple. It can be something as common as avoiding mirrors and reflections or cameras to just not have that focus be directed towards oneself. Or it can be far more destructive. Things like resorting to alcoholism, where one is just out of it continuously and then you don't have to think about yourself. One could make the argument that maybe perhaps not as destructive. Netflix binging is a similar form of avoiding self-awareness. It is an easy way to spend hours and hours without ever having to give thought to oneself or really even the world around one. But that's, since we're focused more on self-awareness, when one is watching television, one is not really oftentimes thinking about oneself. Of course, there are exceptions to this as well, because all the things we're talking about tend to be talking about averages and patterns, not about individual people's experiences. It is also important to know that not all means of escaping self-focus are harmful. In this, for example, it has been found that many forms of religious or spiritual expressions are an effective means of avoiding self-focus. I could do something as simple as saying that this was just the will of God and I had nothing to do with it, and therefore I don't really have to consider myself. You could supplant universe in there if you feel like that's more appropriate than God, but ultimately the sentiment is similar. And this could, of course, carry out to large-scale gatherings where you are all together in harmony on some common suited purpose. And normally in those types of events, we are much less focused on ourselves and can quite easily get lost in the group. We will talk much more about how an individual is lost in the group when we start talking about groups in, well, a few lectures. Now, also, it is important to note that people have widely different opinions about religious expressions and spiritual expressions, and they tend to be pretty polarized in many ways. And I will never say that all religious or spiritual expressions are positive, some are horribly negative, but on that same token, not all of them are negative either. It actually tends to be relatively few that are on either extreme side, and most commonly for most people, they're probably somewhere in the middle. Now, an additional way of engaging, it is slightly on the negative self-awareness side, but you can actually engage this self-focus to maintain one's own moral behaviors or maintain those moral behaviors in other people. Your textbook gives the example of putting mirrors in front of people who are taking an exam, and it has been found that by doing so, people will actually cheat less. This is why you can put security cameras around a place and they need not even be plugged in, and it will actually reduce the incidence of robberies or even cheating, because nowadays they put cameras to watch people who are taking some standardized tests. One of my favorite of these is there was an experiment quite a while ago that put little googly eyes, it's just like funny little cartoon eyes, in public restrooms. And it was found that in restrooms in which these googly eyes were put in a place where the person could see them, they would actually wash their hands more regularly after using the restroom than people who were in restrooms that did not have those googly eyes. The implication being that by looking at another pair of eyes, even cartoon eyes, we are primed to think about someone else looking at us, and someone else looking at us is an effective way to get us to begin to think about how we are and to begin thinking about ourselves. We'll talk a little bit more about this in impression management when we get to it. Yep, I just thought that was a cool experiment that people did. And in our modern times right now, while this pandemic is raging, it could be an effective way to get people to wash their hands more, even though I'm not sure how much people go to public restrooms these days. And it seems like this has all become a political thing anyway, so who knows if just googly eyes and the prime they represent is enough to overcome these weirdly polarized ideologies that it seems like the country is divided in. But again, I will make this note here, please, that even though that's how it seems and opinions are actually getting more polarized, which we can argue is largely dictated by our consumption of media, especially social media, but again, not going to go into there because of people's opinions. Please note that just as I mentioned with religion, there are extremes on either side, right? There are extreme liberals, and extreme conservatives, but at the end of the day, most average people are just somewhere in the middle, and many of them are probably just afraid to express moderate opinions because they will be shunned from the groups in which they originally belonged. Just something to consider. Another note about expectations. So we mentioned that negative states of self-awareness can arise when your expectations for yourself do not match your own behaviors. A lot of this is focused on when those behaviors are somehow insufficient to match our quote-unquote reasonable expectations. But there is an entire side to consider whereby our expectations of ourselves are completely unrealistic. Not only just that we have developed for ourselves, but also that we are given from our parents and our cultures, and therefore we will tend to also experience states of negative self-awareness. One of the most common found here, it's more prevalent unfortunately in women, but it is increasingly common in men as well, is body image related negative states of self-awareness, where we have been told by society to have completely unrealistic expectations of what our bodies should look like, everything from the weight it should be to the muscle tone it should have to removing all of our hair so we somehow look like prepubescents. All of that is not necessarily attainable, achievable, or sustainable for that matter. And when we do not meet up to those criteria, we will oftentimes experience negative states of self-awareness, even though those expectations are unrealistic. So that's just yet another thing to be aware of. And I don't mean to say this that you should just throw all expectations for yourself out the window, but it might be worth critically examining where the expectations you have for yourself actually come from. One more note that I think is quite important to make is that self-focus is not the same thing as being self-centered. Now, self-focus is thinking about oneself. Self-centered is almost operating in the way that only you exist. Much of the time, if you carefully consider this, people who are very self-centered lack the self-focus to actually evaluate their own behaviors, especially in relationship to others, and then understand how self-centered those behaviors actually are. It requires a certain degree of self-focus to understand that you yourself are just someone who only cares about yourself, especially when you haven't really thought about it very much. Because it's been my experience that I've met many self-centered people who actually think that they've been betrayed by other people because of all they have quote-unquote done for everybody else, even though much of what they're doing for everybody else is just their own wishes in the first place. So this is just, again, something to be aware of, because many times when one is discussing this idea of wanting to pay attention to oneself for the effort of either improving oneself or understanding oneself, it can sometimes be labeled by other people around you as being self-centered and put into sort of this negative category. And it's important to remember that these are not the same thing, even though other people might not understand that. When it comes to introspection about our feelings, which is something we do a lot because feelings are complicated and murky, and only at very specific times are they clear-cut with only a single driver. So we do tend to use our introspective skills to figure out why we feel the way we do. But at the end of the day, this is much more difficult than it might seem to us. So a common example given here is to try and understand why we love someone. But at the end of the day, it can be difficult to understand why we feel many of the emotions that we feel. So a silly example of this that I could give to you that is not really relevant right now because I don't take BART. For those of you who don't know, BART is the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. It's the sort of bus train things that go back and forth. So at the end of the day, if I have been on campus since 7 in the morning and I'm going home at like 6 in the evening and I've had a lot of stuff to get done, chances are I will not eat regularly because that is one of my bad behaviors, and I will drink a ton of coffee to just keep going because chances are I will not have slept very much the night before. And if I do this for 2 or 3 days in a row, I will be headed back to the East Bay on the train, and I will get to maybe Civic Center or Powell Station, and the train will fill up. And instead of letting everybody just get out of the train first, people will just try and shove on immediately because I guess they're terrified that the East Bay will disappear if they don't get home in time. But I will find myself at certain moments in time just thinking that they are useless human beings because don't they have the common sense to understand that there must be volume made by people leaving before they can enter? And I will catch myself in this because normally I don't think like this about other people. And it is easy to think, oh, okay, it's just because those people are actually idiots and they're making me feel this negative way. But a more common explanation or reliable explanation that I've found, because whenever I take into account I no longer have those feelings, is that my blood sugar is low and I'm really tired and thus become cranky. And it is my own crankiness that is making me judge them, which is in turn making me feel frustrated with those human beings. Now, we can actually feel our own blood pressure or blood sugar for that matter. There are some subtle cues that might arise, but at the end of the day, we don't have an internal meter that's like, hoo, your blood sugar just went below 60 per unit. So that can further complicate our trying to introspect about our feelings. And this goes to this next point that many of our mental processes are ultimately hidden from and inaccessible to us. And this applies even in perceptual things. This is why optical illusions will always trick our perceptual system, even if we know that they're not actually true. So here you can see some dots. The illusion here is that the two centermost dots of both clusters look like they're different sizes, when in fact they're identical in diameter. You can measure them if you want. This is one of the Mueller-Lyer illusions. It is related to the two lines that have opposite facing arrows on them that are actually the same length, but appear not to be so. And I can tell you that 100 times over, and you can believe it with fervor, if you wanted to say, yet you will always see the illusion. There's nothing you can do to not see the illusion because it arises out of a function of our perceptual system, the underlying mechanisms by which our brain functions. And in this same way, much of our abstract thought and emotionality also comes from mechanisms in our brain to which we have no access to. And thus, at the end of the day, we are making, while maybe educated guesses, nonetheless guesses about why we feel the way we do. Now, of course, none of that is likely to stop you who are now learning about this, or just people in general, from convincing themselves that their introspections about the reasons, or the reasons they generate from their introspections, are in fact the actual reasons why they feel or we feel the way that we do. Now, we're not entirely clueless about this, right? It's not like every single time we introspect about our feelings, we're wrong, but we're also not really very good at it either. And we tend to dramatically overestimate how effective we are at introspecting about our own feelings. Something that seems to strongly influence our introspections, especially when it comes to introspecting about our feelings, is our own personal causal theories. And causal theories refer to our own ideas about cause and effect relationships in the world. And so specifically here, we're talking about the ideas of cause and effect relationships that we have about our own behaviors and feelings. This, or these causal theories, are largely determined by the cultures that we grow up in and the surroundings that are around us. So one common form of this that many of us have heard before is that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Now, just a side note on this, so this does not, one at least completely, hold up under scientific scrutiny. So it has been found that Finally, one of the downsides of introspecting, so we've kind of touched upon this throughout this entire section, is that we're not always correct about our introspections. But this can have a very dramatic impact on us. It can actually change our own attitudes. This is referred to as reasons-generated attitude change, which refers to attitude change resulting from thinking about the reasons for one's attitude, and then people assuming their attitudes match the reasons that are plausible and easy to verbalize. Ultimately, we can actually convince ourselves that we feel a certain way because we introspected about how we were originally feeling, come up with a reason for why we're feeling that way, and then change how we think about the world and ourselves because of maybe a correct or incorrect introspection. Now, one of the places where this has a very dramatic impact is with pro and con lists. And many of us are told to make pro and con lists when we're not sure of something. But if you're making a pro and con list about something that has a strong or even middling emotional component to it, those lists and the choices that they sort of indicate we should take can oftentimes be misleading for multiple reasons. One being just that it is very difficult to write down feelings on such lists. It's hard to verbalize and then write down emotional states or the complexities of our own feelings and inner working minds, while more common things like it will be fun to live in New York are much more easy to put down on a piece of paper. Further, in these types of lists, we're primed to think about more concrete things, again, because of this process of them being easier to write down, and many of our experiences with pro-con lists have those types of items in them. So we're also prone to just ignore feeling and emotional components altogether. This is at our own detriment because at the end of the day, it is those feelings that tend to stick with us in the long run and not necessarily the objective factual information about both pieces. And so we might make a decision based solely on factual information about two different outcomes or possibilities, and then result in being unhappy with those decisions because we did not adequately account for the feelings involved. So while you can still make pro and con lists and use them to great effect, I would recommend perhaps not using them to decide a life partner.